Hey woodworkers. Wanted to talk a little bit about different wood species and pros and cons for each one of these. This is not an exhaustive list. This is kind of the broad strokes of wood species that woodworkers and furniture makers have been using for basically ever. So, last piece about this is that not every species is going to fit your needs every single time, but hopefully between these, there's a couple of options that would be helpful to you in the future. Okay, so starting with red oak. So red oak has been used forever and ever and has kind of been a staple for a lot of different furniture makers. And a couple of the characteristics of oak, uh, I should say red oak, it is distinguished because there is also white oak and brown oak. And subtle differences within these things, color being the biggest one. They're still very, very hard. It's a dense wood. Machines well. It's easy enough to work with tools, but it will definitely beat up your chisels in a hurry. But that's also true of many of the woods we're going to talk about. Okay, so you'll notice a pretty strong distinction between the spring growth and the summer growth, or early and late growth. And the open pores of this material allow for a lot of finishing techniques, some of which could be decorative, other of which could be, these pores could be filled, and when a final finish is applied, it becomes out incredibly glassy. And so one of those options is possibly available to you in oak. With this, there is, it's tough to see here on the edge, but when this material is quarter sawn, this is a bad example, but I'm going to do it anyway. When this material has been quarter sawn, then these radial flecks show up, and those create a really strong distinction of this figure that kind of shows up in very few other species of wood. Um, Lacewood would be another one that pops to mind with this. That it when depending on how it is cut, has a real strong distinction as far as what the look of this wood is. So red oak here, there is kind of this reddish color. All of these boards have been finished. This one has an oil poly wipe on finish on it. And so, all right, that is our oak, red oak. Another wood here, again, kind of going in range of a popularity piece. This cherry is domestically grown, as is the red oak, and has a really great, just kind of or a reddish color. And I think a lot of people associate this with a furniture piece. And uh, unlike the oak that we saw earlier, cherry does really horrible with adding any stain or pigment. It turns out really uneven, really blotchy. So cherry would be an ideal candidate if you just wanted to do a clear finish on top of this, or having a dyed clear coat so that you can kind of omit a lot of the wood grain stuff here. You'll notice that there's a real strong distinction between heartwood and sapwood with cherry. And yeah, generally just kind of a great piece. So this is very plain right here. I guess I wanted to show this just as an example of the figure that you can get in cherry. And so this one has a lot of character in it. And so it looks like this figure is alive, especially the higher the thickness of the finish, and lighting is everything. But both of these are American cherry. There was a time when cherry was the most expensive material, wood, domestic wood, and it's all supply and demand based. That has gone away now, and this is fairly reasonably priced at the time of recording this. It fluctuates pretty dramatically. And now the new kid on the block that everybody's clamoring for is walnut. That one seems to be the most expensive domestic wood at the moment. All right, so cherry. So because of that price structure, a lot of people went to this material here called alder. Alder is also a deciduous tree. All of these so far have been deciduous, meaning they lose their foliage in the fall and it comes back again in the spring. So alder is a decent substitute with respect to color. It's not a perfect match, but if you're going to be spending, if you're in industry and doing thousands of board feet or even linear feet a day or a week, then the cost differential between these two becomes pretty dramatic. Cherry is harder than alder, and aside from that, there are very few differences. The alder also doesn't have much of a distinction between heartwood and sapwood generally, not like cherry anyway. So that is the alder. Maple is a fun species in that it is a very light color, obviously, and just like cherry, does a horrible job of accepting any pigment or stain. A lot of people use this for, well, furniture, a lot of woodworking things. Flooring is a good candidate for maple because it is actually harder than oak. And a lot of people don't associate those two together, but it's really closed pored, and so there's no need to do any pore filling or anything here. Just with building up coats of your finish, this creates a really, really lovely alternative for something very, very hard and durable, but also having the color that you'd run into here. Maple is unique in that, unlike the cherry, where the heartwood is the darker piece and the sapwood is less desirable, maple is just the opposite. The maple is primarily a sapwood species. The heartwood, it still has heartwood, every tree does. This is a different piece of maple, but you can tell that this is less desirable and less noticeable in a maple. But very much the same species, just those are the things that distinguish those. All right, walnut, this is not a great example of it because it's a little bit lighter than I think what a lot of people consider walnuts to look like. It has a slightly open pored structure, so doing various detail work with finishing and highly desirable. Not as hard as maple or oak, but it machines and hand tools beautifully. And this is a better example of the natural color that you'll find in walnut. Heartwood and sapwood are pretty prevalent in this material. And so walnut is great. It is the most expensive one domestically, and I'm sure there are a couple that are harder to find, but it's doing very, very well. And it goes through cycles. It used to be in the 70s. It was used, not done talking about you. In the 70s, it was used a lot of built-in work, a lot of cabinetry, a lot of paneling, and veneered paneling. People got sick of that, and then it took about a 30-year hiatus, and maybe even more, and then came back around here in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years as being kind of the wood of choice. But it's very, very beautiful. I think tricky to use in some factory applications just because of the distinction of heartwood and sapwood. And a lot of times the sapwood is less desirable, so all this material gets cut off and either burned to heat the facility or just tossed. So that's kind of a sad reality of the woodworking industry. All right, next one is poplar, and in contrast of costs, the walnut most expensive, poplar has always been very inexpensive, certainly in comparison, but in the range of woods for use in furniture. It had, and I think the reason for it has good density, it has a fairly closed pore structure, but it has this green hue to it, and that coloring I think is a bit less desirable. This is a good example of heartwood and sapwood, but even when we get to just sapwood, it has this greenish or almost kind of sickly brown, and I know that's a loaded word, but the color, which is different. This is another piece of poplar and dramatically more intense with green and browns. It has really intense reds and purple streaks potentially. So depending on the poplar that you find, and this has everything to do with the environment, and these mineral deposits tend to interact with the tannins in the wood, and it starts to create this really fantastic look. Much harder to find, same cost generally. This one is much more prevalent and available, but it's a good wood for furniture making. It takes a finish very, very well, but again, the color is kind of the killer on this. Artistic furniture makers, they'll use this and then use paint over it, typically milk paint, because they want the density of the wood and the qualities of this material, but the color is the issue. So anyway, they'll use milk paint over this and do all kinds of great carving. It carves excellently and doesn't have a lot of intense grain, much like oak or even a maple wood, and so it's very forgiving, takes to cutting with carving gouges very, very well. All right, the last wood I wanted to talk about is a African mahogany here, and the distinction is there are mahoganies, pardon me, that grow in many places around the world, nowhere in the U.S. anymore. So this is this is an exotic wood, unlike the rest of them that were domestic. And African mahogany is probably one of the less expensive options for mahogany. Genuine mahoganies come from South America and usually from Brazil and those areas. To the trained eye, it's fairly easy to distinguish between a African and a Brazilian mahogany, but you'll notice it in the cost. And it's this really beautiful light reddish brown color, and I think again this has been used for so long in imported furniture pieces. I think people have associated mahogany as a higher quality of material, and it's very, very good. Carves well, sands well, open poured, so you can again get into pour filling with this, other options with finishing techniques. But it's a beautiful piece. The one criticism I'm hearing about African mahogany, certainly in the high desert environment that I live in, is that it reacts very funny to machining in this environment, and so compared to the tropical environment it was grown in, when people start cutting this, it tends to do weird things where one will tip up the other, opposite directions. It can start to pinch on a table saw blade or bandsaw blade. Stability is kind of a factor here. When I was a woodworker on the East Coast, there was less of an issue there, and I assume it has something to do with the proximity to sea level, but that's just a guess. Humidity is probably the biggest factor here, and sea level is always going to be more humid than being in the mountains. So those are most of the woods that you will run across or use for woodworking applications. It's important to know what these differences are and how to use them, and more importantly, why. So hopefully that was helpful as a precursor and will be helpful in selecting your materials for final projects. All right, good luck everyone.